So before we get into what does work in terms of overcoming grief and overcoming fear, let's talk about a couple of things that don't work. Now, this is might sound surprising to you because I'm not a grief counselor, I am a grief guide and a certified grief educator. But traditional grief counseling typically doesn't work. And that was surprising to me when I found out the statistic that, for most people, it doesn't work. Now, I think a big part of that is grief is a natural process that we go through. And traditional grief counseling, I don't think actually necessarily accelerates that process if it's what we call simple grief as opposed to complicated grief. So the grief that comes about, say, when your 95-year-old grandmother dies in her bed or something like that, where it's expected and it's in order and the person's lived a long, fulfilled life and there's no trauma. In that case, the grief is not necessary. Grief counseling is not necessarily necessary, nor is it effective. But when grief is complicated by factors like guilt or trauma or things that are out of order, um, that's when grief counseling might be helpful. Now, in my case, my daughter, when she passed away, she was 15 years old, and it was a sudden thing. And it was out of order. And I did see a grief counselor, but frankly, for me, it wasn't very effective. Now, this guy I think was pretty good. He worked at a hospice, so he wasn't just a traditional counselor. He did specialize in grief, but the techniques that he used for me just weren't helpful. It was kind of that, I guess, just passive listening or active listening, maybe. But it ended up, I saw him 3 times, and I ended up expressing more comfort, I guess, about the afterlife to him than he was expressing to me, because traditional grief counselors won't talk to you about the afterlife. They don't want to step on your beliefs. They don't want to share their beliefs necessarily. And just sitting there and going through the same old thing with him, the traditional thing just didn't work for me at all. Now, what was more effective for me was when I joined an organization called Helping Parents Heal that I'm with even to this day. It's an organization for parents who have lost children, which might be very obvious from the name. Um, the thing about traditional grief counseling, one of the things is there are models for stages of grief, and some grief counselors still talk about that. I think that's totally ineffective because just really not true. That there are these stages, these linear stages of grief that are neat, that we go from one to the other. The fact is, with grief, we tend to bounce around. There are a lot more than 5 stages, a lot more than 5 different emotions that we go through. A grief counselor, a lot of times they'll be taught techniques, and I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but I know there's some very famous things where people will take you through a series of process to get you through your grief, or to get you to be able to integrate your pain and your loss. I Scientifically, they say it's effective. I know that that wouldn't work for me. What I do when I work with clients is it's much more organic because everybody's grief is different. Everybody has a different way of what they need. They have a different feeling about what they're going through. So I believe because everything is different, the counseling needs to be also tailored to that person. Traditional grief counseling, getting back to that, is actually so ineffective that in 2007 there was a scientific paper that was published, and the paper was called "What Has Become of Grief Counseling: An Evaluation of the Empirical Foundations of the New Pessimism." Published, and it was published in Professional Psychology, Research and Practice. And in this paper, the researchers pointed to the popular and the pessimistic conclusion that grief counseling was ineffective, if not downright harmful. The effectiveness of psychotherapeutic interventions for bereaved persons, a comprehensive quantitative review published in a psychological bulletin, reached a similar conclusion. They characterized their data as a discouraging picture for bereavement interventions and added that it provided little to no benefit beyond the participants' existing resources, what the participant already had available to them, and the passage of time. Now, I would take a little bit of exception in that because I don't believe that passage of time actually solves anything. I think time is necessary for healing, but I don't think passage of time itself solves anything. But again, this traditional grief counseling has been ineffective, I believe, because it misses the bigger picture. Now, another thing that doesn't really help when it comes to dealing with grief, or maybe even with fear of death, is religious hope. And when I say this, I mean religious hope alone. And I alluded to this a little bit earlier about how a lot of times religious hope, as opposed to real belief, is just kind of a wishful thinking that we kind of hold in the back of our minds. But because we have no evidence and nothing to really back it up, it's pretty weak in terms of our actual belief. Um, so people that have only religious hope many times believe that there is no evidence, and they try to convince themselves that their beliefs are true, but these beliefs can quickly fall apart when they're faced with tragedy. Now, my experience has been that many religious people have, I call it an unspoken covenant with God. They believe that nothing bad will happen to them as long as they're doing the right thing. It's kind of the Santa Claus God, I call it. If you do good things, God will do good things for you. Now, intellectually, they know that this isn't true. In fact, a lot of people I know that believe that are Christians, and they know that even the Bible tells them this isn't true. But it's kind of a hope that they have that if I pray, if I go to church, if I do the right things, then nothing bad will happen to me. Now, this is totally blown apart in the book of Job. Job was a righteous man in the myth, in the story, and many bad things happened to him. That's really the main point of the story, that bad things happen to good people. But we do tend to hold on to this. And what happens when people only have religious hope, when something tragic happens to them, they get angry. They get angry at God. They think that God broke his covenant. Interestingly enough, a lot of them at that time will say that there is no God, which actually I believe comes out of their anger toward God. It's like a child being so angry at their parent that they turn their back on them, and they pretend that they don't exist. But this does come about when people rely on religious hope only. And again, when tragedy strikes their life, they just don't really know how to deal with it. Now, this question, why do bad things happen to good people, is so prevalent that there was a rabbi that wrote a best-selling book with that title, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? The thing is, religion, I believe, can only take us so far. I mentioned earlier, and I've talked to Christians well into their 80s who have believed their whole lives that they were going to see their love when they believed in the afterlife. But when it comes down to it, as we face our own mortality, and as we get to the point where everyone around us is passing into the afterlife, if we don't have a really clear picture of where they're going or where we're going, it can instill fear. And I believe, again, religious hope isn't quite enough, at least for me, to quell that fear. So that's the second thing that I think doesn't necessarily work. Now, the flip side of religious hope is atheism, or more appropriately put, materialism. And I'm going to separate those two out, even though they're often conflated. Atheism is the belief that there is no God, or Gnosticism is a belief there's no evidence or no proof that there is a God. You can be an atheist and still believe um, in the eternity of the soul, if you want to call it that, or the spirit, or the mind, or consciousness, whatever term you want to use. Soul is a religiously loaded word. I think mind is more neutral. I prefer the word mind or consciousness. But atheists can believe in an afterlife, for example. They just don't believe that there's necessarily a God, a being that is the overall ruler of the universe. But materialists, on the other hand, are people who say that we are biological robots, and that we come into existence when we're born, and we pass out of existence when our bodies die. So this, I think that term has been used before. That I call it scientism, where people believe in this as a faith. This materialism, or this atheism, is actually a faith. It's as much a faith as someone who believes in God. To say that there's only the material, that there's no such thing as consciousness, which some materialists have said, or to say that consciousness is an illusion, or to not acknowledge the fact that I believe that consciousness is the foundation of the universe. This is this is a metaphysical point of view. So when we have this belief, when we have this, and then it is a belief that we are a cosmic accident, that we are not coming from anywhere necessarily, and we're not going anywhere, I don't believe that really works really well when it comes to dealing with grief or the fear of death. Now, my friend Kelvin Chin, who I've worked with quite a bit and wrote a great book on overcoming the fear of death, talks about the four belief systems, and not in terms of religion, but the four belief systems that people hold about death and why they cause fear. One of the belief systems is the belief that there is no afterlife. Now, logically speaking, if we believe that there is no afterlife and we believe that at the end of our physical life, we are going to cease to exist, logically, there'd be no reason to fear ceasing to exist because you won't be there to experience it. But I think naturally we do fear ceasing to exist because I think, again, I think that's kind of built into who we are. We want this eternity. We don't want to cease to exist. And it does cause fear. And if we have this belief, I think as well as just as people may seem, when they say, I just accept the truth that this is it, that my life still has meaning, there's still beauty, there's still joy in the world, but this is it. That just doesn't do it, I think, for a lot of people on a very deep level. So I believe that's why that doesn't work for many of us or for most of us. So those are the three things I don't believe actually work. Traditional grief counseling in most cases, religious hope or religious belief, or a scientific materialism, atheistic point of view that says that there is nothing beyond what we have here. So now that we talked about what I believe doesn't work, next module we'll talk about what does work.